I'm John Nixon from Eagle Lake Woodworking, here with the latest accessory for the Super Sled. It's got all the features of a commercial jig, including micro adjustment, a built-in scale. There's a leveling system to get the Tenon Jig perfectly square with your tabletop and your blade. I think you'd be surprised at how easy it is to make. Let me show you how it's made. The two main boards for the Tenon Jig are constructed out of 3/4 inch plywood. They're both 8 inches wide. The vertical is 11 3/4 inches tall, and the base is 8 inches by 8 inches. The first set of holes that we're going to drill will be in the bottom of the baseboard. There'll be a hole in each of the 4 corners that will receive a small nut, and this will create our leveling system. We'll have bolts that you'll be able to adjust the Tenon Jig to get it perfectly square to the blade. So I've positioned my fence, this stop block, and a dummy piece of wood so that when I position my piece, the front set of holes will get drilled a 1/2 inch in from both corners, and then the holes on the rear will get positioned in 1 1/4 inches and a 1/2 inch. With the fence and the stop block still in place, now I'll drill the through holes. So when you drill the right size hole, the nut really won't fit in there on its own, but a couple of taps from a hammer embeds it flush with the surface. You can even thread the bolt in a little ways and seat it to the bottom of the hole. So the bolts go in from the top in all 4 corners, and that'll give us complete control over leveling the Tenon Jig and getting it square with our blade in both directions. Now it's time to make the 2 slots in the baseboard, and we'll do that on the router table, but we'll drill 4 pilot holes which will represent the beginning and end of those slots at the drill press. We'll finish off the slots with a 3/8 inch spiral upcut bit, and I've positioned the fence so that the bit comes up through the pilot hole, and we'll just move it forward and we'll stop when we reach the second pilot hole. Make sure you have a firm grip on your workpiece when you start the router, just so it doesn't move, and have the bit catch the wood. Here at the bandsaw, we're going to make 2 cuts that will remove the material for the clamp recess in the vertical piece of the Tenon Jig. So I've set up my fence the correct distance away from that to make the first cut, and I'll make that first cut using a 3/4 inch board in place, and then I'll remove that for the second cut. We'll remove this material by making a cut from both sides with the chisel. Okay, the third piece to the Tenon Jig is a simple right triangle, and it measures 6 inches on the right angle sides. It's time to assemble the jig, and we're going to glue it in place using biscuits for reinforcement. So there'll be 2 number 20 biscuits in this area that hold the vertical piece to the base piece. And we will also biscuit the triangle to the base as well as it to the vertical. The biscuits go into the end of the vertical piece, the bottom, and I just put both pieces flat on a work surface and cut the biscuit slot. And to do this, we'll stand the piece up and cut the biscuit slot. So I'll mark the location for the biscuit on both boards, and we'll use that pencil line as well as the mark that I made to position the biscuit joiner on there and cut the slot. Now we'll just position the biscuit joiner on the triangle and cut those slots as well. We'll just do a dry fit to make sure everything goes together the way we want it. That looks good. Let's glue it up. Before anything dries, I'm clamping 2 squares to the base of the tenon jig that I can use to square up the vertical piece as I clamp it in place. I'm also going to put 2 countersunk screws to make sure that the triangle is tight up against both pieces. So here's the vertical fence piece for the tenon jig, and I've clamped a square to the bottom of the tenon jig so that we can install this fence piece exactly perpendicular to the bottom. Now the only thing to be aware of is to keep this last screw hole clear of where the blade path will be on the bottom of the tenon jig. So it's about 3 1/4 inches up from the bottom of the tenon jig, so that even at the max height of the blade it'll never hit this screw hole. Now here's a good tip. Before we install the leveling bolts, you want to wrap them with a little bit of Teflon tape. And this will keep them from vibrating out of place once they're installed. Installing the tenon jig is simple. We just slip 2 T-bolts into the tracks on the Super Sled and then place the tenon jig on top of those bolts through the slots that we created. And the tenon jig slides all the way back against the rear fence and gets locked in place with these knobs. So here's where those levelers come into play. Assuming you've squared your blade to your table saw's tabletop, we can square up the tenon jig to the Super Sled. We have adjustment this way as well as this way. So we're going to square it up perpendicular to the Super Sled as well as perpendicular to the fence. One way to set up to cut the tenon is to mark the board and then position the tenon jig on your line. Another way is to zero out the tenon jig on the blade and then measure back the distance that you want to cut from the edge of the board. And that's the method I use. I've embedded a scale even with the surface of the Super Sled. And when the tenon jig is zeroed out, the back side of the tenon jig will be at 0 on the scale. So when I move the tenon jig away from the blade, I can easily tell the offset. Another feature I've incorporated to get micro adjustment is I've added a bolt through the stop block. So if I make a movement on the tenon jig, I can put the stop block up against there and then turn that bolt and micro adjust the position of the tenon jig and easily know where it is based on this scale. Well, that does it for this part of the video, but I invite you to check out the all-new Eagle Lake Woodworking to see the rest of the videos in this series and videos on other woodworking topics.